Hello and good morning, Mr. Ben.
Hello, it is just morning still at my end, but
Very good, very good. Bowbirders, we are going to talk about word of mouth today and then how that relates to architects and also publishing, because sometimes they're thought of as two separate things when we're actually talking about it as they're similar or they plug into each other. They're just working at different scales. And we're doing all of this because we've got a big report here based on word of mouth. And so we've got all this data, research, case studies, interesting things to dig through, and then our sort of take on all of that.
yeah, we've talked about this in the past. We've actually done a podcast episode on word of mouth in the past, and to be honest, not a lot has changed since we talked about that. But I think we've just got a bit more vocabulary as to how we talk about it.
Yeah, and I think unpacking it, being able to understand it in more detail. So we want to work through different size firms, different time spans in firms. We want to look at some of the pros, some of the cons, which the cons are often ignored, and then how publishing plugs into that and how they're related. So, where do you want to start, Mr. Ben?
Well, I think one thing we as we always do with these podcasts, we get AI to do a little bit of work for us. And I think the best thing that came out of the AI that I was looking at, or the summary of what I was looking at, was them calling it WOM,
Yeah.
WOM. It sounds like some sort of electrical hum. WOM, 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 WOM. Anyway, word of mouth, WOM. So I don't know, maybe we just start calling it WOM and see if that catches on.
Yeah, I noticed that too. And I wasn't sure if AI had just made up this new term, or are there people out in the world talking about word of mouth so much that they have an acronym?
Let's just Google it and find out. Is like if you type in WOM,
WOM. Does it
does it
show
come
up?
up? Word of mouth, yeah, word of
Yeah.
mouth technology. I mean, that's a brand though, but yeah. So WOM,
So
the thing.
listeners, if you want to sound like you're in the know when you come across a word of mouth expert, just drop WOM as the term. So do you want to give a quick definition of what word of mouth is?
I mean, word of mouth, also referred to as referrals. If you're talking about in the broad sense of what word of mouth is, it's one person telling another person about a thing. And when you talk about in terms of business, really, it's a referral to a product or service from someone who has used that product or service.
And in architecture, people will often think of their clients as the engine of word of mouth, but it might also be consultants. It could be other networks that architecture are involved with. It could be, you're part of a social group or some sort of committee or an institution. Anyone who's talking about you is basically spreading this network of you and your services, and they're doing it either in a positive way or a negative way, that's the double-edged sword, which they're often thinking about the positive comments, but they kind of ignore the negative comments that come out of it.
Yep.
As an example of that, I was having a coffee on the weekend and I bumped into a friend who said, "Oh, I've just bought a block of land." And I said, "Oh, that's cool. That's cool." He said, "Yeah, we've engaged an architect. We've got this design." So he pulls out the phone. He's showing me the pictures. So all positive word of mouth. And then he says, and they've gone over budget by $1 million. And he's saying, what do these people think? Where am I going to find an extra $1 million? And I've just spent $30,000 in architecture fees on something now that I can't build. This to me is this great example of you have all this positive enthusiasm and then it's been turned into negativity. And out in the world, that must be happening a lot with architects because the number of architects who go over budget.
Well, and there's always this thing of within service industries, like I think it's a McDonald's stat or something, that what if one customer is complaining, there are 9 people who think the same thing but don't tell you. So this idea that if you hear one piece of negative information, that's probably a 10-fold impression of the sentiment out there. So I think I think that rings true, having dealt with customer service and customer support. You'll see that you kind of go, okay, yeah, this isn't just one problem. This is obviously a problem that's affecting lots more people, but only one person has put their hand up and said, that's not great.
So our data here suggests that, particularly with small firms, they get 70 to 100% of their projects through referrals. So
Okay.
this is really high. Now, how accurate is this? Does that include, your website is getting traffic from a different place? It's also,
Is there a source? What's the source from that?
I've only got the summary in front of me right now, but I would imagine that a lot of smaller firms, they are getting a lot of referrals, or people are talking about them in some sort of closed network because they don't have an existing reputation. So they don't, again, reputation is actually word of mouth. It's just scaled up. But in the beginning, you imagine your first project might be a small renovation. You've got one client. It takes you 1 or 2 years to get that built. And after all of that effort, you essentially have one client and any consultants that you worked on to give you word of mouth. So one of the criticisms of word of mouth is that it's very slow. It takes a long time to build up, and your network is relatively small. So it's like a direct connection with people that you've already worked with. But those people generally have a lot of influence because you have direct contact with people. So that's the balancing act with word of
Well,
mouth.
and within architecture, you have direct access to the final product in a way that you might not for other things. So you get to sit in someone's house for hours, potentially days, maybe if they're a close enough friend. So you actually get to experience the final product and make your own assessment as well.
Yeah, so the impact of word of mouth has all of these, random is the wrong word, but they're unpredictable. So you don't know if your client is very sociable or if they're a hermit. So if you've got a very social friend, they've got lots of visitors, lots of people coming through the house, your architecture is being displayed all the time. If, on the other hand, this is a project which is hidden away, doesn't really see the light of day, the walk-through traffic and people talking about it will just be less. That's the hard bit with word of mouth, is trying to understand the mechanisms of it, because ultimately, if it's driving 70 to 100% of small architects, you want to do that as well as you can. Otherwise, you're going to be missing out, and somebody else is going to be out competing you who is doing word of mouth at a higher level. So that's kind of a starting point. One of the interesting things here is talking about how you actually improve your word of mouth, which is this idea of the quality of work that you do, which is obvious. Like, you do really awesome architecture, but also the experience that people have working with you. So you try to think about good products or services where they've really cultivated an experience versus just the product. And this is something that architects might not be thinking about as much, like what's happening inside their office, or how do they make that user feel. As an example, when you buy a house, the real estate agent always sends you that tacky gift basket with a bottle of champagne or something.
When you buy a house, I love this always. Yeah. How many houses are you buying?
It doesn't really happen that often anymore,
Yeah,
does it?
it's happened to me
But
once.
what they're doing is they're cultivating this experience, and they're trying to evoke an emotion, which is, I think what they're doing there is they're doing basically a referral program. They're trying to make you feel special, and they want the basket on the bench so that all their friends come through and see the new
Well,
house.
what's interesting is thinking about buying a house. We went through a mortgage broker. That mortgage broker was referred to us by a friend of ours. When we closed on the house, the friends got a bottle of champagne and we got a bottle of champagne. So they understand how important referrals are. And so they invest in, again, the experience. They're investing in, well, I guess it's reinforcing that word of mouth again.
Well, that's interesting though, isn't it? Because they've incentivized somebody else to do the referrals. So that's what this report is also talking about, is how you encourage word of mouth. So a lot of architects, when they say we get all of our work from word of mouth, what I think they're actually saying is we don't do anything, and we don't consciously think about this as a process. It just kind of happens. And the issue I have with that is you're being reactionary. And so if that fails or if that changes in time, you're kind of just going, but what happened? Whereas the people who are looking at this going, well, how do you improve your word of mouth or that user experience? They're going to be in a much stronger position over the longer term with
Yeah.
their business.
Ask yourself, how can you measure it? So what does that actually look like? Like, did that process of that referral look like? What did the past customer or past client say to that person? When did they say it? Was it someone who'd visited the property? Like, if you don't have the answers to that, then just saying, oh, I get everything through word of mouth is, well, I think the phrase that came up this week was hope marketing. You're basically
Yes.
just hoping that that next client is going to somehow come into contact with this person who's going to say great things about you and send you to your office. Like, that's crossing your fingers. Like, that's not good enough anymore.
Yeah. Hope marketing is a great term. And especially when you compare it to your competitors. And architects aren't very good at thinking of themselves having competitors. They tend to think of themselves as an industry or a profession, and it's very good to be collegial, but ultimately you have competitors, and the people who are doing this better than you are getting more work, they're getting better work, they're getting higher budgets. Like, there's a reason why that happens. It's not just hope. It's not just the end product either. Like, you can think of a whole range of architects who do beautiful work, but that client will never, ever, ever use that architect again in their life. The pain was too high versus what they got out of it.
Imagine just the cost of that as an activity is like for a lot of people, is a once in a lifetime investment. You will not do that again.
So you're really trying to maximize the number of people who come out of an experience with you with positive reviews versus the people who come out with negative reviews. The other thing is actually getting those reviews. Like, obviously you can't control the conversations in a coffee shop, but you can ask your customers for testimonials, and you can include them in things like your media kit, like involving them, like getting that word of mouth outside of those conversations into other mediums like your website or when you're getting published. That's how you start to expand it beyond what people normally think of as word of mouth.
Yeah, and I think it's this thing, like, we talk a lot about virality. So if you've got something where one person recommends two people and that's a consistent equation, then you end up with this exponential growth. I don't think we're talking about that. Like, we know enough architects out there that there's not sort of many practices that are experiencing exponential growth. So there's probably not a 1-to-2 ratio here. We're probably talking about less than a 1-to-1 ratio for most projects that are based on word of mouth. Coming back to the numbers of what you're actually going to get from word of mouth allows you to understand that missing 25% potentially of your new business, the people who are not coming into contact with you because a friend recommended them, they're coming into contact with you through Instagram, through getting published, through any number of different channels, being involved in something like open house. You know, that sort of activity is the 25%. And what's that 25%? That's the growth of your business or the sustainability of your business. If at any point your referrals drop below 1-to-1, you have a business which is declining.
It's also your ability to drive your business rather than it driving you. So if you're just reliant on the word of mouth, your business is, you just accept whatever comes through the door because you don't have enough work and you don't have enough high quality projects or enough choice of type of work. Whereas if you can drive that and you've got more people knocking on your door than you can work for, you start to go, actually, I do want to do that project because that's a really awesome project, which again, you choose an awesome project. Guess what? You're probably going to get better word of mouth because more people are talking about the good work rather than the average work. So this is where you come back into these cycles. We often talk about positive or negative feedback loops, and getting a really awesome project, getting people to talk about it and getting it published is creating the positive feedback loop, because now you get more potential customers who you choose the best one. So now you're already starting ahead because you're working on cool projects rather than trying to get average projects to look better than they actually are.
There was a line that came out of our little AI Notebook LM podcast, which was, you can't market your way out of bad work. And I liked that. Like, you have to be doing good work in the first place. And good work just means work that is appreciated and someone is willing to pay money for. You know, there doesn't have to be a lot of value judgment there, but it's really just saying, to start with, you have to be doing good work. Like, you have to have that as a base.
Yeah. And it's also when you think about how you're solving problems. So let's say you do have an issue with budget control and people know it and they're talking about it. Even if you don't hear it, if you're running over budgets a lot, guaranteed people are talking about it. So what you're trying to do is balance that word of mouth so that if there's enough perception that, hey, you go over budget sometimes, but you do this amazing work, great. There's some sort of balance. You need some positive reviews or people talking about it, which again is what media does. But ultimately, you need to come back and solve the original problem. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're pasting over the problem and trying to play this game of spin rather than actually going, how do you create that amazing user experience so that over time, you just don't have to deal with that.
Yeah, that example of the negative feedback. If you're not hearing about it, then it's hard to know. But you probably do know if someone's come through the door and said, "This is my budget," and then you've blown that out by 100%. You probably know that was something that was not going to fly. But I think what is interesting is if that's where the work is, if your work is at that, let's just say a $2 million level, and people are coming in with $1 million budgets, well, you've got a mismatch between that conversation. So this is again where referrals, despite being incredibly powerful, they can also fall down if those people aren't talking about pricing. Someone walks into a $5 million home and says, "Oh, I want one of these, but I've only got $500,000." That past client may not be telling the truth around how much they spent on that. So this person's coming through the door, you're spending a lot of time, you're getting to that point, and then you go, well, you can't have that because that's $5 million.
It's another issue with word of mouth that I see, at least when you're at the low scale. So you imagine you got word of mouth, which starts off, you've got a small firm, then you get larger. Eventually, word of mouth isn't functioning once you get really large, and then you need to amplify it with things like media, which essentially is just word of mouth, just at a much larger scale. Is that when you've only got a handful of people talking about your work, you're hoping that they're connecting with an ideal client, and they don't always match. So friends don't always have the same budgets, styles, or even personality. Like you're thinking about matching yourself with somebody who is going to get a good outcome over time. Just because two people are friends doesn't mean you're going to create the next masterpiece with them, which to me is going, you want to expand that word of mouth large enough, again, so that you can filter down and find that ideal client, again, to get this positive feedback loop.
And again, that's telling the story. So yeah, obviously someone coming into a space that you've designed, that's an amazing, they've got the experience. They understand what it is that you make. But there's so many stories that go into that. And this is what we're always talking about, find all of the stories, tell all of the stories that you possibly can, because that's when you actually refine that down. That's when you filter those clients. So you go out wide and then you filter it down to the people you want, rather than hoping that there's a one-to-one equation where you find the ideal client from your last client.
Which is why tagging as many people who were involved in a project in your media kit helps you increase your word of mouth. Anybody you tag, this is just a general principle, whether it's social media or publicity generally, if you tag somebody, they generally want to share that with their audience. So
they're proud of it.
They're proud of it. So this is including your client, obviously. That's your starting point. If you're not including your client and getting a testimonial off them, you're missing the key part of amplifying word of mouth to all the consultants, the builders, the people that architects tend to hide from the world because they don't want anybody stealing their builder. You're missing the trick. You're missing the ability for them to share your work with more people, and go one step below that as well, all the staff in your team, because the word of mouth is functioning for your recruitment process as well. You look at that and compare it to, you start off thinking word of mouth is one person, when for that one project, you've probably got 20 people who want to talk about your work and multiply it out to the world and their social networks.
I'm just wondering about the negative side of word of mouth. And do you think that fear of people talking about them is what some practices struggle with? Like word of mouth as a general concept that, oh no, it all works out in the end, is actually about not putting themselves out there, not actually doing the work to understand how all of that stuff happens. Like, because I know we come across this a lot where architects are focused on what they do, which is the design and delivery of architecture, right? But marketing is such an important step in that. It's how you close the loop in your project cycle. I'm just wondering if there's do you think it's a fear-based thing around word of mouth as well?
Yeah, I think it's validation. Like, obviously, you're putting yourself out there designing something which is subjective. So people will have different opinions because it's a style-based industry. So some people will like the design you have and others will not. The reality is that that commentary is almost always positive. Like, you see a few publications now where they have far more public comments. Like, I think the Zine has a lot of comments now.
Yeah,
and they're trying to spark that debate. Debate's not a bad thing, though. Debate is probably the thing you want, because you're dividing, a group of people into either haters or lovers. So you imagine any of the products that you really love, iPhone versus Android. Okay, there are going to be people who say the nastiest things about whatever phone platform you are on. But the fact that you're passionate and you actually have a view and you're willing to dedicate your time to writing things on the internet about that demonstrates that they've got a loyal following. So I think you want to be getting out there as long as you're doing great work.
Where I'm thinking about this is a lot of architects don't seem to think about where their work is coming from. It's not everyone. It is a generalization, but we talk to a lot of architects. They're not really measuring, so they're not looking at the pipeline of work. So where their inquiries are coming from, they're not understanding if there is word of mouth, they're not digging deeper into why that happens. And I wonder if that's where the insecurity is. Like, rather than they see the power of word of mouth, everyone does. It's amazingly powerful. Obviously, 70 to 100% of your work coming through word of mouth, it's obviously powerful, but understanding it and then thinking about how you can amplify and replicate that, I think that's maybe they don't want to go down that path.
Well, as a starting point, you can ask people who come through your door how they found out about you. You can do that on your website form as well. So if you get general inquiries like, how do they know about you? That will give you a sense of where they're coming from. Is it just a Google search? Is it actually a referral? You could ask them when you first have that meeting, oh, how did you hear about us? And you'll probably start to hear the positive stories, like that person is referring a lot of people to us. Guess what? That's the relationship you should be nurturing right there. And the other thing this report was talking about is people often forget that you have to nurture your network. So you're thinking, again, when you just go, I just get my work from word of mouth, it's like having a garden and just say, my garden just grows. It says, yeah, but if you think about pruning your garden, are you fertilizing your garden? And in a sense of word of mouth, what that means is being front of mind to people who were talking about you, let's say 5 years ago, but have forgotten about you. And one of the case studies, this is one of those light bulb moments in the report for me, is talking about the life of an architectural firm, especially these, let's say, multi-decade firms, where in their mind, they're front of mind and everybody thinks that they're an amazing architect because they've been published, they've won awards, they feel like, I've done it, tick, and now I've got so much work, I don't have to worry about it. And then the case study was talking about how firms fall out of favor or even just fade. They just kind of disappear. And what's really happening is competitors are coming in, that next generation who are hungry, and they're doing a new style of architecture. They're getting published more. They're jumping on social media. And those really established firms are just they're not competing. And then suddenly they've got to dip in the referrals or the work coming through the door. And they're now scrambling, trying to figure out, how do we reestablish ourselves and how do we build that new network?
Yeah, it's got to be a sort of consistent, constant gardening, tending to your garden.
Well, because there's a natural attrition rate. So you think about, you have a network, you have engineers, you have clients. Over time, people sell their businesses or they retire or they move to a different city. Like, things change. So that network is constantly degrading. Like, people just move on. So you need to have something you need new plants in your garden, and you may not need a lot. You may have a lovely practice, you've got all the work you love, but you just want to be making sure that you've got that next crop, which is growing, so that they're ready to harvest when you need them.
The other fascinating thing is just thinking about when you're saying, hey, how did you find us? We know this from years of talking to architects, is they either don't ask that question, or when they do ask the question, they're not digging in to ask more questions. So this idea of, where did you hear about us? Oh, my friend John hired you 3 years ago. and I love his house. And they go, cool, that's a referral. The bit that they're missing, or the bit that they're not digging into to get deeper in that process, is, okay, and then they saw you on Instagram 2 months later, and then they saw you in a magazine a year later, and then they saw you all over, websites for the next 2 years. And then they walked through the door. They're not going to tell you every time that they've come into contact with you and your practice. Maybe they subscribe to your email newsletter and they've been getting that every week. You can't just say, okay, it's all word of mouth. It's like word of mouth may have been the most powerful piece of the puzzle of why they knocked on your door, but it is almost, I can't believe that there is anyone who isn't also coming into contact with you in all these other places.
It's a bit like going, I have a front door. All my customers walk through the front door. That's doing all the work. And you're not looking at what's happening in the outside world that drives people to walk through your door.
Mm-hmm.
I think with all of these things, it's about being conscious of it. You don't have, obviously, all of these marketing ideas, probably overwhelming for some architects, but just starting to think about it, like get that first data point, start to track where those customers are coming. Now have a number. Like, how many inquiries did you get this month? Was it 2? Was it 4? And then ask yourself, would your practice be better if that number was 10? So if it is, then you're asking yourself, how do I move my business to just getting 10 inquiries rather than 2? And then asking yourself, well, I wonder what those inquiries were. Were they average projects? Were 9 out of 10 the ones that feed us, but they're killing our soul? And there's one that's actually amazing, and it's worth more, and it's exciting, and that's what we really want more of. Then the question is, how do you get to all of those inquiries being good ones, or just enough to sustain you? You can still get 100 average inquiries to feed you, but now if you've got 10 to choose from, which are amazing, you've transitioned your studio from a bread and butter studio to one that's actually doing really exciting work and that you're proud of, and you get all these, again, positive feedback loop.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting, if you are an architect or a designer who has a practice, looking at the practices that you admire a lot and going, they're probably in that position where they're getting 100 inquiries and they get to choose the 10 best ones. Reverse engineer that. Try and figure out what they're doing that you're not doing.
Yeah, if I was to summarize let's say, what is the benefit of word of mouth, but let's say amplified word of mouth. So we're talking about, how do you do this really well? How do you combine it with media, and why you might do that? One of them is that you want to shift your business somewhere else. So you want to do different types of work or better quality work. You want to be able to open up an office in a new city. Like, even just that one, you think about if you're only relying on word of mouth, you've built this amazing practice in one city, and then you go, I'm going to go expand into this new city. Then you're going to go back to ground zero to start word of mouth again. You think about how long that took you in your original practice to do that, compared to going, how do you skip that phase, and how do you build an audience who's thinking about you and now talking about you without having to wait 10 years to build all of this work? So all of these benefits really come back to, where do you want your business to get to? What's missing in your practice right now, and how are you going to get a plan to do it? And it's probably going to involve a combination of word of mouth, your quality of your work, and then the breadth and width of your audience. That's what publications are giving you. They're giving you...
Amplifying.
Yeah, like the AI gave us this phrase, which is, publications are the megaphone of word of mouth.
Mm.
And they're doing something very similar to word of mouth in that the journalists are validating you. They're giving you a stamp of approval in the same way that a referral does. So there's trust. You're being chosen, and you want people to see you being chosen by other people. It's like that human trait. On top of that, those publications are allowing you to jump borders. This is how all the biggest architects, they're jumping outside of their local network because they're basically pouring petrol on it. And now they've got this huge fire going on where everyone's talking about their work. That's how they're getting that inflow of new customers.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well. If you're getting published and it's just a project and you're not telling the stories behind that as well, tell the client stories, tell the testimonials, because that's literally amplifying word of mouth. That client is saying, this was a great experience. The end product is amazing. And that's going out to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people over all these different platforms. So that is literally amplifying word of mouth.
It reminds me of something we talked about years ago, which was this concept of fame and what the mechanism of fame is for humans. And people think of fame as Tom Cruise, one of the most famous people in the world, walks in any room and somebody knows that face and they treat that person differently. If you get a phone call and says, hey, this is Tom Cruise, you may hate Tom Cruise, but you're probably going to pick up that phone. It's just, that's the nature of the power of fame. But fame really is just that somebody else is talking about you. And so word of mouth is this micro fame, which is going, one person talked about the thing that you do. And then you have 2 people and 3 people and 4 people. And really, you're getting these benefits from expanding the level of fame around your work until eventually there's just so many people talking about you that it changes your life, your career, and the opportunities that come through your door. So again, it's interesting how people naturally, it's like they're trying to restrict their word of mouth, or it's like they're trying to restrict their own success in a way because of the fear of success. There's probably a whole, we've probably just gone on this tangent. It's unlocking the psychology of architects here.
We aren't therapists, not. But no, I mean, that's a really natural human thing. This is the thing about networks as well. We want to find the people that are like us. It makes us feel secure. We then have a group around us that we have a manageable group of people that we can go, cool, I'm safe here. And the reality is that's not really how the world works anymore. We aren't just part of a single community village. We're parts of massive networks or wide-reaching networks. And I think that fear of being exposed instantly to millions of people, that's a natural fear. But I think it's this thing of, you can't be afraid of going, okay, if I had 100 inquiries, oh my God, how would I even manage that? Like that's a weird sort of psychology. If I was getting 100 inquiries per month, I'd have a problem, rather than going, okay, I get 100 inquiries per month. That means I've got 10 projects that I can cherry pick from and choose the ones that I want. So it's a good problem to have. Don't be afraid that you need to turn 90 people away. Be excited that you get to have a really awesome conversation with 10 people.
That came up in the research recently too, which is about waiting lists, the power of waiting lists, and being able to turn people away actually highlights your value, because there's too many people who want your services. If you can just jump on a project and do it instantly, like there are industries where you want that, obviously, like Uber, you don't want a wait list and you're waiting 3 hours. But in industries that are related to quality, like something like architecture, having a wait list is a good thing. You create a wait list because there's more people knocking on your door than you can actually work for. Again, you're trying to increase that top of funnel and forcing yourself to filter. And if you do that, you end up with higher quality work, higher paying work. You have choices rather than, starving and taking on that project, which you inside hate yourself for. And you go, how did I end up in this position?
You sound like someone who's speaking from experience.
Look, I have been in that scenario where you're feeding the monster, like within an architecture studio, where you've got a staff and a team, and you need that next project to bridge that gap and figuring out how you get there to keep going. But that's why I talk about those feedback loops, because when I was young, I didn't know any of that stuff. I didn't think about it. And so now we do.
Cool. Anything else on your list?
Anything else on the list of word of mouth? No, I think it's just this connection, probably just honing in on what you do with media to amplify that word of mouth. So it's like we've already mentioned, it's really pulling out those stories, making sure that you're involving people, adding that to your media kits, but also making sure that you've got this consistent stream of projects going out into the world. As soon as you fade, you don't exist. And so your brand is disappearing over time and your word of mouth is dropping. There's probably a way to measure that. There must be, I guess it would be, people might measure it on social media size or interactions or the number of referrals that you're actually getting coming through your door. But finding some number there that you can write down and go, we're getting better at this or we're getting worse at this. So
That is kind of one of the tricky things. Architecture struggles with this in that most of the work is doing the work, right? So you've got 6 projects that are on your books at the moment. You've got a team of 4 that are working on it. You're thinking about those things, and you're not thinking about what happens in 6, 12 months, 2 years, 5 years when things change. And I think that's it. You want to make sure that while things are good, while you're busy, you are actually doing something towards getting inquiries next year, rather than getting to that next year and going, oh, we've got a quiet time and crap, we haven't been doing anything for the past 6 years.
And then you're waking up and it's like you feel a bit faded, and how do you recover your brand? And it's easier when you're young because you're new. I think it's those older firms that's fascinating, the process they must be going through, because they also lose directors. So those directors had a lot of personal networks, and suddenly, did the firm actually have a brand or a network, or was it the individuals within the firm who had the network? So again, how do you build up that presence, and how do you keep it going over the long term?
Diversifying your word of mouth as well. That it's lots of different people talking about you, not just one person's network.
Well, because I can think of firms where there's one director who is a network machine, is known all over town, is getting work in all sorts of areas. You think if that person gets hit by a bus, that's your business gone, because you're relying on the word of mouth of that individual rather than the word of mouth around the practice. So there's probably a separation of people and the office itself.
So if that's you, don't get hit by a bus.
No, don't get hit by a bus. I think that's pretty much wraps up my thoughts on word of mouth. Have you got anything else on your side?
I think probably the last sort of thing that I'd like to focus on is don't convince yourself that word of mouth is all that you need to be doing. Don't have that internal dialogue that I get everything through word of mouth. I don't need to think about it. I don't need to dig into it. If you are getting all of your work through word of mouth, you should know every interaction in that process. Dig in, ask questions, find out what that word of mouth actually looks like. Because if at the end of the day, you're like, we don't need to do anything, word of mouth is all we need to do, you'll have something to back that up. You'll be like, this is how I know that this is all we need. I don't think any practice can survive just on word of mouth. You may be able to survive. You may be able to survive for a certain amount of time, but eventually it's not going to work as well as it used to. So be conscious, be aware, ask yourself questions.
You might be asking yourself, let's say word of mouth is going to a certain group and networking. So that's great. You start to ask yourself, is that the right group? Is that actually bringing me the customers I want? But also, what happens when I stop going to that group? Or what happens when I stop that word of mouth strategy? Does it stop? What you're really doing is you're talking about a habit that you're building over time. It's not like a marketing strategy. I think people think of like, hey, here's a big ad campaign and it changed this big business. Word of mouth is probably a bit more like a marathon or a habit that you're going to do every single day. It's like, how are you increasing your exposure, word of mouth? Who are you talking to? Who are you meeting with? When we do this for ourselves, like every week, we typically are meeting with journalists. We go out for lunch or we jump on a Zoom. So call out to any journalists who want to have a bit of a chat. We always love talking about what you're working on. And what that's actually doing is you're building up a network behind the scenes and you're building that word of mouth and referrals and so forth. So, but it's not, if we stop doing that today, the whole process would stop. You need to be thinking of that as something that we just will always be doing. It's good when we jump into a new city. We want to go visit people. We want to go see where their office is. Because again, word of mouth is building relationships. And actually, which is probably what we haven't talked about, is the strength of a relationship in word of mouth. There's probably one of the criticisms of media is that you might have fame, but it's a very soft word of mouth. It's like from a distance versus somebody that you have worked with, and there's somebody who's very loyal and will speak the best things about you all the time. So figuring out how you increase that bond,
which comes back to nurturing the garden. I think that's the other interesting thing about getting published or talking about what you do, telling your stories, is that you continue to engage and build that relationship. So the relationship may have happened offline in the real world, but you need to keep reminding that person of how important your relationship is. and getting published, telling your stories, associating yourself with the right people and publications makes a difference. That's how you tend the garden.
Very good. Okay, folks. Well, thank you for tuning in to another one of our Bowerbird videos. If you have any questions or things you want us to unpack, I guess on LinkedIn, that's probably the best place, I'd say. Or send us an email if you've got our email address.
Awesome. Okay.
Here's to the next one.
Bowerbirders. Bye.